So our next speaker, which I'm really delighted to introduce, is Dr. Lesley Fellows. She is both a neurologist and a neuroscientist and works at McGill University, where she is associate professor at the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery, and also attending staff neurologist at the Montreal Neurological Institute and Hospital. She completed her PhD in physiology at the University of Oxford, and then her medical training and residency in neurology at McGill. Her research program, very interestingly, examines the brain basis of complex human behavior and addresses some of the mechanisms by which emotion and reason are related in the human brain. Her work involves maintaining a registry of patients with focal brain damage to support this research, one of the only such registries in the world. And she also took up a lot of administrative obligations in spite of being an active neurologist and neuroscientist. She was responsible of the MD PhD program at McGill, and also served I think was very appreciated as an interim chair of the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery for 3 years. So thanks for joining us. I know you're very busy, and we look forward to learning more about neuroscience.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a really great session. I hope to do my part to keep it great. Dr. Weinstock has started us off here with a tough challenge, really. So let me start right off with my neuroscientific obligation and dismiss dualism. Okay, there. We're all set. As a good neuroscientist, I do think that all human behavior can be explained by processes that are occurring in the human brain that could, in principle at least, be described in physical, chemical, electrical ways, and that there is nothing more than that. But that's already a great deal. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this, in the hopes that between the three of us will give you a whole range of ways to think about this general theme, and hopefully it will all come together through your insightful questions at the end. So part of my job is to put up pretty pictures of the brain, so we'll get that out of the way right off the bat. So I'm going to try to talk to you about how much we actually know now about how your brain makes you do it. I'm going to assert that your brain does make you do it, and that's all there is to it. But let's talk about what that actually means. So, the real question, I think, is what does neuroscience bring to this conversation? As was already mentioned, this is a long conversation, and many of you might think of as the broader behavioral sciences already have a lot of challenges to pose to very conventional views of free will. So what does it bring further to look at the brain as opposed to just looking at behavior? So I just want to present this analogy to see if it helps you think about it. You could say, I've got some speed skaters up here in honor of the Winter Olympics. You could ask the same question of muscle physiology. You could say, what does muscle physiology add to our knowledge of athletic performance? Possibly nothing. If you want to know how to get skaters to skate fast, you could just put them on the ice and get them skating and just watch their behavior. Then you could train them and make them faster and see who's fastest, and that would be that. And it doesn't necessarily it's not necessary to look at how their muscles work, even though we know that their muscles are important in this process. But it is the case that people are very interested in muscle physiology if they're trying to make fast speed skaters, and that indeed knowing more about how muscles work could help you optimize training, could help you predict who is going to be an elite athlete and who will never get there no matter how hard they work. So knowing more about what's under the hood when it comes to muscle, it can be very informative for understanding human performance. So I'm going to make the same general claim about what neuroscience brings to our understanding of behavior. Let's see if you buy it. So first of all, we could ask, before we get too far, can we know the brain basis of human behavior? Because if we can't, I could just get off the podium. So we can. What are the implications? So psychology is the study of behavior, and cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology takes that one step further and asks how behavior relates to the brain. What are the underlying brain processes, brain substrates that generate behavior? That doesn't necessarily have to be alarming. The fact that I could potentially explain to you how your behaviors are produced in brain terms is actually, I don't think, any more alarming from a philosophical point of view than the fact that I could probably predict what you're going to do next just by asking your mom to tell me more about you, right? That a personality test or other kinds of observations of your behavior can tell me a lot about what to expect from you on average in terms of your tendencies. And that knowing more about how your brain works just adds more detail to that, I would say. I'm asking you, is it a threat to your conception of free will that I could predict your behavior to some degree with a personality test? And is it different if I make that prediction based on a biological measure, like a brain imaging study or a genotype test of some kind? Is that more or less of a threat to your idea of free will? And I guess I would assert that I don't think any of these things threaten free will per se. So, this is just in case you haven't. So, what I study is in part the brain basis of self-control. And thinking about self-control is useful in terms of understanding how it works in the brain and how knowing more about it might help us understand why our behaviors are what they are and why they're not always exactly what we intend. So it's just a general case that we know that there are multiple kinds of systems that together produce behavior. I think one of the main central problems with these folk psychology or intuitive ideas about self and free will is that although behavior comes from the brain, it doesn't just come from the brain in a simple way. The brain has many interacting systems that between them can generate behavior depending on the details. So for example, we could think about parts of the brain that are important for simple drives like hunger. So those parts of the brain are fairly basic and they're quite effective, as you might imagine. So if you're hungry, the hypothalamus and just a few bits and pieces of your nervous system will be enough to get you food. That they can run your organism towards food even without much more brain. So that might be one reason why you're eating and one mechanism that supports behaviors around eating. Another very common kind of level of behavioral control is what you might call a habit. And for example, a coffee break. So maybe every day around 10, you get up and go to the cafeteria and you probably select from a fairly small range of possible pastries. Certainly if you eat at a hospital cafeteria like I do, there's really a restricted set of options. And you might do that even if you're not hungry. And you might not even think about it much or at all. You might just go, you might just do it every day as a habit. It's that time of day, it's the moment, you're in the cafeteria, you're going to eat that food. And that's a complex behavior, but it's largely triggered by the context that you're in. And it tends to be a learned behavior and it's repeated many times. It's when it goes really wrong, it's a fundamental feature of drug addiction. But in normal everyday behavior, it's actually a common set of brain systems that are producing a lot of behaviors that are sort of unthinking, but they're triggered in a rich way by your environment. And then there's the kind of behavior we usually mean when we're talking about free will, which would be some kind of goal-directed, abstract, perhaps, behavior where you get in mind that you're going to do something for a reason, and then you organize yourself to do it. And it might take multiple steps, it might be very distant, it might require driving across town, and negotiating with other people, but you could potentially carry out a goal in that way. Your brain's up to it. So then the question is, what in the brain controls these? I'm not necessarily going to go through this in all detail, but you can think of different levels. And there's a very simple level, right? I don't know if you can see the Far Side cartoon here, this very much used Far Side cartoon where one amoeba is saying to the other, stimulus response, don't you ever think, right? So very simple organisms, but also very simple parts of our nervous system work like that. They're really strictly reflexes. With an input, there's an output. It's totally predictable. That is a very tiny part of our nervous system. As soon as you get above things like your pupil constricting to light, you're getting into systems that are not predictable in that way. They're predictable in a general way, and that's interesting, but they're not strictly predictable. You think about the internal environment. We already talked about hunger. The external environment and what can draw your behavior. Some of which could be habitual, some of which could be goal-directed. And then these abstract goals that I mentioned here, distant in time and place. We know something about these different systems that do this, and the fact that there are different systems from studying people with focal brain injury, and this goes back centuries to observations of people who have had the misfortune of getting brain injury. A famous patient named Phineas Gage, whose skull is sitting here. had an iron rod driven through his head by an unfortunate occupational event when he was tamping a dynamite charge while building a railroad in New England. And he made a name for himself at the time and over the subsequent 200 years, mostly because he survived. But he did presumably have frontal lobe damage, and he was a changed man after the injury. And like other people with frontal lobe damage, the ways that he was changed had to do with self-control largely. So people with frontal lobe damage become more impulsive, more distractible, more driven by their environment and less by abstract goals. And sometimes also are inappropriate in social interactions, and there's been some work on whether they are able to sort of be appropriate from a moral point of view in some situations. So we know from these kinds of observations that this is part of the reason that we know that the brain produces behavior. So when you mess with the brain, you mess with behavior. And it's one thing to drive a iron rod through your brain. It's another thing to have more standard neurological disorders, and still another thing to just think about normal individual differences in these abilities. So we know that all of these different brain systems that I mentioned vary in the details of their biology and are affected by education, learning, social contexts, moment-to-moment considerations like how tired you are, how stressed you are, and whether you're taking psychoactive medications. So lots of things can change the state of your brain and can affect your brain's structure and function. And these can lead to normal variations in self-control in ways that we could specify. So I could tell you that people with a certain dopamine gene or people who haven't slept well tend to have a weaker ability to control their themselves in the situation of, let's say, attempting food, for example. And that maybe wouldn't surprise you, probably from observations of your own behavior. But I guess the question is, the fact that I could tell you how that works in the brain, does that threaten free will? So let me go to the last slide, I think, and make some claims here just to keep the conversation going from the neuroscience point of view. Say that what neuroscience adds to this discussion is a richer level of explanation. So looking under the hood can tell you more about how behavior is generated. We observe behavior at the level of the whole individual, but inside our heads there are multiple interacting systems that together are going to produce that behavior. And understanding the characteristics of those systems can help us understand why we behave the way we do, and why in some circumstances, even though we intended one thing, we might end up doing another, like happens if we fall off our diet. And that the highest order kind of goal-oriented brain systems are particularly fallible and likely to fatigue and let us down at the wrong time, but that doesn't mean that we can't engage them and that we can't direct our behavior according to reasons. The other thing about the brain that's interesting from a free will point of view is it is stochastic, so it's got probabilities rather than causalities in the strict sense of the billiard balls built into it, which introduces uncertainty at multiple levels, which in itself is partly why our behavior sometimes surprises us. All right, but none of this explanation, I would say, removes responsibility for our actions. That explanation is not excuse. Sorry to Eric's 3 children. In fact, it may empower us to expect more of our behaviors. The more we can understand the limits of the biological systems that we are, the more we might be able to construct environments or arrange our lives so that we're not put ourselves too close to those limits. It also can help define the limits of expectation in ways that might be useful to society, for example, in thinking about extreme situations, neurological or psychiatric disorders, for example, that might mitigate responsibility. There might be a level where excuse starts to come in. And the last point is that knowing more about this might provide a rationale for decision aids or treatments or other approaches that might make it more likely that everyone, regardless of the state of their brains, is capable of interacting in society with maximum autonomy. So I think I'll stop there, except to just mention that my research is supported by you, so thank you to the many public funding agencies that support this general research, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you a little bit about it.
Thank you, Dr. Fellows. I will be sure to bring home this knowledge of neuroscience so that my kids stop saying my brain made me do it. And they read the right neuroscience, not the wrong one. Donc, pour résumer rapidement en français, on s'est fait exposer à une complexité des neurosciences où plusieurs sous-systèmes dans notre système nerveux sont responsables pour le comportement, pour les décisions, de sorte que c'est tellement complexe qu'il y a seulement les parties simples de notre système nerveux qui sont prévisibles de manière très déterminée, mais lorsqu'on monte dans l'échelle de complexité des comportements et des processus, on se rend compte que c'est très difficile de prédire. Et juste pour faire une parenthèse, l'expérience que je mentionnais en introduction, c'était une expérience très simple. C'était pas une expérience qui impliquait des décisions très compliquées. Donc il y a peut-être des choses qui sont prévisibles, mais peut-être pas à un niveau d'ordre supérieur.